Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com Roundtable, brought to you by TechStrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of TechStrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel for you today. First, a couple of housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, and I'm sure you will, we do want you to go ahead and send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which will be found on the right side of your screen. Over on the right side, you'll also find that chat tab, and that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts throughout today's program, or maybe just tell us from where you're joining us. And of course, before we close out, we'll be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around. Our topic for this discussion is the state of SRE, and I'm joined by Matt Schallert, Senior Software Engineer at Chronosphere, Nung Badel, CRE and SRE at Fairwinds, Uma Mukara, Head of Chaos Engineering at Harness, John Turner, Manager of Customer Engineering at StrongDM, and leading our conversation today is Mike Vazard, Chief Content Officer here at TechStrong Group. To our panelists today, thank you for joining us. Mike, take it away from here.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. Let's get started with kind of where are we in this whole state of the SRE? So let me start with Uma and say, hey, we went from, a few years ago, everybody running around going, what the heck's an SRE, to now everybody wants one and can't find one. So where are we right now in this march towards adding SREs to the IT universe of people that we have out there? There's no shortage of titles these days. So what are you seeing?
Yeah, nice to be here, Mike. You're right. SRE has been a buzzword a few years ago, and it's a coveted position, and people were not sure, do we need a practice of SRE inside the organization or not? But now I think, the whole digitalization has gone leaps and bounds up, and we see there's a huge need for maintaining the uptime, and systems are became complex. So we now see the right need for SREs to be there. There are organizations setting up SRE practices, and we are getting what's needed for SREs to be thriving, and a lot of developers are trying to become SREs. That's a good sign, and that's what is needed to be a good SRE function. You need very, very strong developers. So we see a whole different functions being created around SREs, and people are trying to innovate around the uptime through this practice of SRE. So I think this is a whole new function that has become live in the SRE practice.
All right. Well, now that we got that far, I also want to remind everybody that there's chats and Q&A buttons up there that we're monitoring. So if we have a question as we go along, feel free to jump in. We'll address that as we go along. Don't need to wait to the end and all that good stuff. Matt, this one's going to you. What does it take to be an SRE these days? What does it mean? We've had applications and websites that we've deployed for years, and so suddenly we need an SRE. So what is the difference? What does it take to join the SRE club?
Yeah, it's funny. I think there are kind of two aspects to it. There's one is, what you need from kind of the people that are in that role, which is, people that kind of think about the systems holistically. Like Uma said, think about how to maintain uptime, especially in increasingly complex environments. But I think that there's another side to it, which is that in order to be an SRE and to kind of follow those practices, you also need the company to be bought into it. Because especially from a business perspective, it's not easy for a company to say, oh, we haven't hit our uptime goals for this month so far, or we're kind of on a dangerous track, so maybe we have to pause rolling out new features or something similar. So I think from the individual perspective, you need people that think about those practices, like measuring, SLOs and uptime and everything correctly, and knowing kind of when that cutoff is of when you're taking on too much risk, and kind have to revisit stability.
John, let me follow up with you on that point. Uma said, these people are essentially developers that are learning to manage the infrastructure, but do I have to be a developer, or do you think as we go along, SREs will evolve into something that is, just using automation tools of some type with a GUI maybe interface, and sometimes some folks are using an API or CLI and other folks may be using a GUI. So is this thing going to become like a giant team sport? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, right? I've seen it where you have strong developers that have more of an interest in that infrastructure side, and then also the opposite, someone who may be from the IT and operations side that eventually gets an interest in understanding, how to deploy, how to understand uptime, measure those SLAs, those SLOs. So I think you don't necessarily have to be a strong developer to start, right? It's an interest in how do things work and how do they connect together, and the general interest in technology, and just having that curiosity and that broad interest to start diving into that, right? Right. We have many tools in many different forms, right? You have Terraform, which is infrastructure as code, where you may not be a strong coder, but learning that tool helps you understand the basic concepts to understand that deployment, right? Or you have things like Kubernetes, which is an abstraction of general virtualization, and understand how things interconnect and making, these large environments on a few machines that may have cost you thousands before, but now you're running in a super virtualized environment. You control everything. So I don't know if you have to be a strong developer. I think you want to have an interest in it for sure, because there's going to be plenty of stuff that you touch that you're going to have to troubleshoot that you may not have seen before that's on the coding side. And I think that leads you into wanting to learn more and develop more. So I think it's going to cut itself out as its own niche. We have DevOps and then we have SRE, and, they perform two different functions, but there's a lot of crossover. And I think they're going to slowly start to separate, but then figure out where that middle piece is and who owns what.
All right. Well, we have our first tough question. So I'm going to,
well,
go ahead.
I can, I agree wholeheartedly with John and Uma and Matt. And one thing that Uma had mentioned is that, an SRE is like the new buzzword, but it's a new buzzword for something that has really been around for a very long time. I remember getting, my chops as a software engineer, and then wanting to understand more about the computer systems that they run on, and knowing what the system administrators are doing to prepare the servers for my code to run. And then owning both sides of that in a startup, you realize, okay, you're doing everything. And then someone comes and says, well, hey, there's a name for this. This is called DevOps, or it's now called DevOps. And then I feel like DevOps that has leveled up a few times is now what we call, an SRE. And then take it one more level up where you specialize your SRE, your site reliability engineer, into a dedicated customer profile. Now you have a customer reliability engineer, and everything that the other three guests have mentioned are all wrapped into it. It is a catch-all, and it's becoming, becoming the coveted title for your resume.
All right. Well, I want to ask this question from one of our attendees here, because I think you may all have, well, maybe you'll all agree, but let's see. I want to maybe rephrase it. So if I get it wrong, somebody let me know here. But it seems to be saying that, is there a best model for having, say, a dedicated SRE function? And if you do that, though, will all the rest of the software engineering team just check out on the whole operation side of the equation, because they'll focus all their times on applications and they won't care much about the infrastructure because it'll be somebody else's job? So, Matt, how do I have my cake and eat it too here?
Yeah, I think this is really important where kind of deciding the structure. This question kind of gets at, there are different models out there, such as embedded SREs versus a dedicated separate function. When I was an SRE at Uber, I saw a mix of both. And I think in both of those cases, it's really important to kind of model it and push SRE as a partnership between developer teams and SRE teams or embedded SREs. Because if there's not a partnership, then kind of like you said with accountability, you might, and you said, Mike, you might get to that issue of, feeling like people are throwing software over the wall and letting another team kind of own the reliability and kind of like deployment of it and everything. So I think the way to have your cake and eat it too is to really have those teams be partners and agree on kind of their operating model. And like I was saying earlier with, SREs kind of helping those teams along as opposed to being the ones that take over and ownership at some point. We really have to have both teams involved in kind of whole end-to-end life cycle of managing your software.
Yeah.
Uma, are you seeing the same thing, or what are you guys seeing over at Harness?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's not like, as Matt said, either or. Accountability in the end will go to the software engineering teams, but we just start out the SRE function just with the engineering teams, and then try to push it on them. It never takes off, right? So it's a kind of a culture that needs to be brought in, and that culture comes with a dedicated function. So I see the need for having an SRE dedicated function that brings in the focus, the budgetary necessities, and also the goals. For example, you need to bring in a lot of tools into the system. And the earlier question was, do we need developers? Earlier it was, but now you get a lot of tools for SREs to function. So for doing complex tasks, you need developers, but to get started, you may not need it. So to get in all these tools into the organization, into the operations, integrations, you need SRE function. That's when it becomes easy. As it starts out, you actually start pushing what in this engineering teams need to do as part of reliability. For example, observability metrics need to be built into the product sometimes, and chaos needs to go left, right? And like many other things of SRE need to have certain requirements from engineering teams as well. So I see that to summarize, there's a need for both. You start out as a separate function, but in the end, the success will really depend on if the accountability is spread across all the teams or not.
I think that point about tools is really interesting as well. I think that's kind of some of the way that you can build a shared culture is by teams using the same tools. So, for example, maybe your SRE team develops the deployment software that both the developers and the SREs use, or they work with each other to develop the alerts and build experience with like their monitoring systems. And at that point, you have everyone kind of using the same tools and interacting with your applications in a similar way. And I think that that's kind of a way that you can use, this tool set to also build that kind of culture of shared responsibility as well.
Nung, are there phases of becoming an SRE to go to this question? Because I'll talk to some folks, and to be honest about it, they'll be like, well, yeah, I'm an SRE. And then they'll go, but, we've got a bunch of custom code and scripts and these giant tarball things that we wrote to kind of maintain the environment. And we call it automated, but, the day one of them quits, it all goes away and falls apart because nobody has any documentation. So how automated is all this really getting? And what is this more aspirational than reality at the moment?
Well, if you're lucky enough to be in an organization where there are phases to an SRE, then congratulations, because you're able to to lightly step into the role and take minor responsibilities and gradually build up. But I think that you kind of get thrown into the role. So depending on how much chaos is at your organization, that determines the need for someone who can stand by the reliability of the site and also work with the development team to make the applications that you support more resilient, and then also develop tools to enable more streamlined code pipelines and metrics gathering, and also log diving and log aggregation. All those things that you need to have in order to have a really robust environment.
Matt, where do you think we are? Are we still stitching together a lot of tools, or are we having actual platforms? And while we're speaking of platforms, what does the dreaded platform engineering phrase mean?
Let's see. In terms of where we are, I think we've kind of touched on this of the different phases that SRE has gone through. I think some organizations might have taken roles that they had that were more classic, like operations roles or something, and tried to rebrand it as SRE. And I think because of where different people are on the path, whether they brought it up as a new function or kind of tried to rebrand something, I do think it still means different things to a lot of organizations. I think probably the standard definition that people go off of is the Google SRE book that kind of introduced the concept. And as people say all the time with software as well, you probably don't have Google problems, so you might not need to just copy their exact solution. And I think that that's actually a good thing, because I do think some organizations are realizing, how to kind of apply SRE practices to like their own business and organizational needs to kind of come up with what it means to them. In terms of the platform aspect of things, that's a tough one. I think, I think, again, that's probably something that makes sense at larger companies, is to have, platform engineers that might be building abstractions, but that always gets tough, because at some point, every abstraction, you either have to build it to, or it's kind of, maybe it's too generic and your developers just have like opaque views of applications and might not be able to take advantage of all the features that their cloud or something that they're deploying on like Kubernetes offers them. So I don't know exactly where we are yet, but I think that's another one where it's about finding the right balance, and still exposing powerful tools to your internal engineers, while also not making them have to know every little detail from like cloud networking all the way up to like deployment of your software or something.
John, sorry, go ahead.
It's good that there is like an aspirational model to this that people can point to, because like you said, not everybody needs to be a Google or wants to be a Google necessarily, but you want your product to succeed, and in order to do that, your platform has to be reliable. And how do the big boys do it? And the big boys and girls do it, and that becomes the model that you strive for.
100%.
All right, John, we have a question from the audience that I think is going to play to you, but we'll see how it goes. What role, if any, does an SRE play in incident response? Because in one theory, you would have it that they're supposed to be automating things, so there isn't an incident in the first place. But the reality is there's always incidents. So is an SRE like what, level 3 now, level 4 in the support chain after the initial contact, or where do they fit?
Yeah, so human error still exists, so you can automate anything. But if somebody pushes bad code, right, like even if you codify your whole infrastructure, it's going to cause issues. I mean, we've seen that happen numbers of times, right? Like somebody puts in the wrong variable or sets a value to the wrong thing. So it should reduce that downtime, but it doesn't stop it. We're all a part of that. But where exactly they sit will depend on the organization. And what impact it is, right? Because when we talk about incident response, it's a huge breadth of topics, between infrastructure to security to various things. So it's going to depend on your incident, first of all. But normally they'll sit in that higher tier, as you said, and that's going to depend on the organization. So if it touches that'll be between platform and SREs being in that 3 or 4, depending on your model, because every company is not the same, right? We're not cookie cutters. So we always, depending on scale, and then depending on the model that you've built out your infrastructure, is going to depend on where they sit. But most of the time, they're going to be sitting at that higher level whenever you have those incidents.
Yeah. Oh, so go ahead, Uma.
And one more thing is this incidents have been there much before SREs came into the picture, right? So these are, you can call them as tickets or whatever. So the function of SRE, in my opinion, is to make sure that you are doing less manual work and eventually doing a lot of automated work. So, and SRE is a practice, as I was alluding to. So there are so many levels of people that get into the SRE function. So there's always like, you can get some SREs to look into incident responses, because they need to understand what's going on so that they can automate. So that information and knowledge is very much necessary for SREs to become, as a function, become successful, but not necessarily that it's an SRE job. But that feedback has to be put into the system, and it's really about having the right tools for all these things, right? So as Matt was saying, Google SREs or Netflix SREs, they are like not commonplace with everyone. Good news is that you get tools for APMs, incident responses, SLOs, chaos. So each function of what an SRE is supposed to do, you got good tools now. So you put in these tools and then learn from them. And some people, have to be continuously doing automation. So incident response is kind of fitting into what needs to be automated.
Yeah, I agree with Uma about kind of having it as a process and not the job of SREs. I think if your SREs are the ones responding to every single page, I think then they kind of just become professional firefighters, which is not good for them and also overall not good for the organization. So I think that's why, and I think in the past few years, there's really been a shift to this of developers being on call for their own services as well. And I think that goes a lot back to that kind of shared responsibility model. And to John's point, people make mistakes. And also if someone is deploying, a new release or something that they worked on a feature for, and that feature is broken when it rolls out, the people that worked on it are way better suited to kind of debug it and be involved in that incident rather than, again, just kind of throwing it over a wall and having someone else figure it out.
No,
Yeah, and
go ahead. Sorry.
And on that subject too, the amount of tools, there's a lot of internal tooling that's created by development teams and SRE teams, but there's also a great deal of open source tools that have been released by these companies that benefit the entire tech community. And I see a rise in that as well, especially in the last 5 years.
I will say,
oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, to add on to Matt's point, also in that shared responsibility model, right? When you have that understanding, that communication, the cooperation between the teams, you also see like lower times and incidents for resolution. So those things get fixed faster because people understand where the issue lies. So we're able to push out a fix or roll out more hardware, right, or whatever it may be for that specific incident when they understand their responsibility within that model.
So one of our attendees is not asking a question as much as putting out a statement, but the statement reads, SRE teams should operate as a service to delivery team. So Nung, let me ask you something. Are we seeing SREs because it's kind of the role or the function that supports this notion of continuous delivery, and now that we're getting better at continuous delivery, we need SREs? Or they kind of, is that the flip side of the same coin, or those two things joined together? As you go down the path for continuous delivery, you kind of start thinking more like an SRE, whether you call yourself one that or not.
Yeah. Well, I think any organization that has SREs are also going to have an organization that supports their developers, the DevOps teams or the SREs, or the cross training between the two, where you are responsible for your pipeline so that your continuous delivery pipeline works, because it too is like anything else, another program, and it is prone to failures or problems that are going to stop the flow, and you're going to need to get in there and fix the problems so that you can really reduce those delivery cycles or failure cycles so that they're not there for a very long time. And also, if you are involved in the continuous delivery, you become even more acquainted with the services that you're supporting, because sometimes you have to dive that far back in the pipeline to find a root cause of a problem.
Yeah, I think continuous delivery is something that you kind of have to work your way up towards, and depends on a lot of SRE practices. For example, if you're not correctly monitoring your services or knowing whether or not they're broken, and you don't have confidence that your tooling can, detect a bad continuous deploy and roll it back, then all you've done is build a system that gets bugs out to production more quickly.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of that involves like adopting those practices before and having confidence that, if you start pushing out like a bad deploy, that your tooling will stop it or roll it back, is really important to have that first.
Uma, are we seeing, because of all the manual processes that we're still relying on, and we haven't quite fully automated things, but is there a lot of burnout among SREs that we need to watch out for? It seems like it's a job function that, like everything in incident management, is inclined to have a lot of stress associated with it. So, what do I got to do, or how do I kind of protect my SREs from, checking out after a year and saying, I got to go find something else to do for a living?
Yeah, definitely, it can get to burnout when you try to do everything by an SRE team. SRE is, you have to have different functions within the SRE teams, right? So you tend to go and respond to incidents. You tend to go and be part of the delivery pipelines. And at the same time, you're trying to continuously, the medium term goal is to reduce your MTTR, right? So how fast you can recover, or how are you avoiding the failure, right? So as long as you're keeping these goals very clear, then some part of your team are continuously trying to help achieve these goals, and then you can avoid the burnout. Where I've observed burnout is, you're pushing your team with no clear goals, and then say that, hey, I need to resolve these things immediately. We don't want any incidents to happen, right? So if incidents are part of life, right? So they will come and go. And in fact, we are advocating bring more incidents, right? So bring chaos engineering, right? Bring chaos, try to break things. So don't worry about the incidents happening. You can, as long as you are able to control them. But more important thing is, are you learning from these incidents, and how are you trying to either recover faster or avoid them? So the burnout is happening in cases where you don't have a clear differentiator among these job functions. And it is happening in few places, and people are learning. And I think there's kind of a maturity models are also developing for SRE as a function, right? So you start and then don't have like super large goals in the beginning, but have automation as a goal, have lesser incidents, or more common incidents need to be reduced. This kind of goals will help reduce the burnout over a period of time.
You guys agree with that, Matt? You got any advice for helping people avoid that burnout issue? I mean, it's rampant in everything in IT, but in here in particular.
Yeah, I think it really depends on how much the org has kind of empowered their SREs. I mentioned earlier, if your SREs are just glorified firefighters, then that's a pretty good way to burn them out really quickly. I think it kind of goes back to, and this is actually one of the things from the Google model that I think people should adopt is, SRE teams kind of being empowered to say, okay, look, we've had too many incidents recently because of, issues that we know are problems, but we haven't invested time in fixing them. And they kind of need to be able to push back and ensure that the teams developing those applications are going and putting the time into fixing that. And sometimes that might be, application level bugs like poor usage of a database or something. And sometimes that could be things that are more infrastructure-y, like, we haven't properly set up redundancy for some component. So I think the way to avoid burnout is to ensure that the SREs are empowered to kind of push back on that life cycle and push back kind of on, timelines or other priorities to make sure that the things that cause burnout are being addressed.
Now, you work for a managed service provider. You have lots of clients. You look pretty chill. So what's your secret?
Well, actually, I was just typing this. I mean, having a well-staffed team helps a lot, because you're able to spread out the pain, and being able to collaborate on issues and not being the one stuck with the sole responsibility, but knowing that your team is responsible for it helps a great deal as well. that I felt working as an SRE or a DevOps in a small team, a small company. A lot of that rested upon your shoulders, and the burnout happens quickly because every issue is your issue. But spreading out the pain, having dedicated times where you're not responsible for the on calls or the incidences that come up with the customer communication gives you a moment to just take a beat and relax. And then going more into what Matt mentioned too, having not just buy-in from your own team and developers, but also having buy-in from as far as around the SLAs and building in, because if an SLA is too tight, get with your management team, get with your customers, and try and find if there might be more room where it gives you a little more breather to deal with issues.
All right, John, you're in the customer success part of the equation. What's your secret? What do you see?
Yeah, I mean, staffing is definitely a huge key of it, right? If you don't have enough people, especially with the talent, it'll cause burnout quick. But I think understanding that risk, right? Like as it was alluded to, is not everything can be a priority, and things are going to break. So we have to understand and evaluate, to the best of our ability, what's a priority, and then understanding the risk involved of not fixing X or Y, and focusing, on those things to move the ball forward. So that way, we can start having less stress, right? What things can we implement now? What's going to have the best impact, and like how much time and effort is that required, and making sure to set forth those goals, as Uma said, because if you can't fix things, you're going to make things worse, and making things worse just means that firefighting that Matt talked about, right? We need to understand how to move the ball forward, and that may not be now. That may not be 6 months from now. That may be a year or more, and we have to understand and accept that risk and be able to move forward as an organization. Because it's going to be painful now, but it'll be 10 times harder when the company's 5x or 10x or 100x bigger. So we see that quite often. People will hop jobs just because there's not that investment, or there's not that leadership to come in and understand from their perspective, like how they're feeling and what needs to be done in order to move that ball forward.
I think you got to resist the urge to classify everything as a high priority, and take a beat and really look at the issue and find out, do we have time to work this issue? And in some cases, you find out better resolutions to them when you do that.
Yeah, I think both of you raised a really good point about kind of prioritizing. I think a lot of that goes back to what your business needs as well. I think kind of prioritizing or quantifying like your risks or the outages you've had based on business impact, it makes it really easy to know what you should go and fix first. Like at Uber, we saw this where if rides were down in a city or in multiple cities, it's very easy to say this is how much revenue would have been lost in that period of time. At Chronosphere, we have a similar practice based on we have really strong like SLA guarantees, and we're able to kind of understand what the impact of an issue would be. And I think having kind of tying that prioritization back to the business of like, okay, this thing goes down this often or has like this much risk, and if it goes down, here's the impact to the business, makes it really easy then to also get other teams on board with taking the time to fix those issues as well.
All right. Hey, Uma, we have a question from the audience that kind of goes to helping to address this, I think. I mean, we've all seen or heard of the Google documents related to SREs, but it seems to me that most of that is about, what is an SRE and why you should have one. Do you think there's frameworks or guidelines that are a little more prescriptive that an organization can follow for setting up an SRE organization that are similar to, say, the Agile framework or something of that line? Or maybe is that something we need to develop? What do you think?
I would say it's evolving. The need for SRE has been accepted by most of the organization. We don't have a kind of a standard or talked about a model for implementing the SRE. Google SRE is a good guideline. But what's also happening is a bunch of tools have evolved in every area, right? I keep talking about tools, but that's the reality, right? So a few years ago, you wouldn't have so easy to use so many powerful tools across the different pillars, right? For example, the APM systems are more powerful, right? So a few years ago, you wouldn't know how to set up your SLOs and track your error budgets, right? So you needed very senior SREs to set them up for you. But now you have, you can have your entry level people set them up, configure them, and you keep going, right? So similarly, the observability, open telemetry is coming and putting, various different things, different traces are coming into something that everybody can absorb. Different chaos tools are coming up. So I think as long as tools are put in a place with proper goals, SRE practice is going to kickstart towards success, and the model has to be evolved. I think more and more. There's no standard per se on it's still a loosely held concept, but there's good understanding of how you're going to develop SRE success. That's starting to happen.
Matt, do you think that each organization is going to have to define their own framework then, or is there something somewhere between, I need an SRE and something that's overly prescriptive? Is there a middle that we can get to?
Yeah, I think that middle is, each organization kind of understanding what it means for them, or what their needs out of SRE are. I think that having some framework that and you kind of see this, for example, with Agile as well, as the question mentioned, like very few two companies do their implementation of Agile like the exact same way. Everyone's kind of figured out like how it works best for them, and I think that kind of SRE practices fall into that category, as well as like you said, something that's overly prescriptive is probably not going to work for everyone. I think what probably works best is when each organization decides what it means to them is to write that down and kind of have something that they refer to internally. Because I think, if it's not codified somewhere, then people are going to disagree on it. Maybe they say like, oh, well, this isn't how we operate or something, when someone else had a different opinion or vision of how it should work there. So I do think at least organizations kind of saying what it means to them and being consistent about it is probably the best approach there.
Yeah. And to add to Matt's point, how do you write that down is at least now getting standardized, right? So you define your SLOs and have them published, and to actually implement your SLOs, you need SLIs. So it just goes from top down, right? So it brings in certain kind of discipline, and it forces you to think, right? So do you have discipline, certain goals or not? So I think we're saying the same thing, Matt. You need to have clear goals and then try from there, and tools can help.
Yeah. Nung is having a little sidebar here in the Q&A section, so I just thought we'd bring that up right about now. But I think the sidebar is basically about, where exactly do I put all this stuff in my pipeline, and how do I monitor it, and are there anti-patterns, and where do they fit? There's a bunch of questions in the general topic, but Nung, walk us through it a little bit. How do I kind of insert this? And I'm asking the question because, frankly, a lot of this stuff is supposed to be in the pipeline, but I feel like we have a hard time finding it. So where is it, and how do we get at all this stuff?
Yeah, I kind of took the question to kind of mean like the how to ensure that you also have reliability in the pipeline. And there's just a number of ways to do this and not have to rely on a developer who knows they just updated code and are expecting a result at the end in a destination environment, but having the same types of alerting and messaging that you have on your production sites built into your pipelines, because you have to treat your pipelines like it's production for your development team, and having that same logging and messaging and alerting when things are failing or things are not coming out of the pipeline, as well as sometimes when things actually go into the pipeline, some may find that it's too much noise, but it's a signal that different people at different phases of the pipeline can tune into, and having those signals out there, everybody can then tune in to the part of the pipeline that they are most interested in.
All right, cool.
I will say,
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I will never find that as too much noise. Somebody who, any information and all information is useful. It just depends on what team, right? And having that stuff cataloged somewhere is great for when we talked about incident response or understanding is it a bug being deployed to somewhere. Because like if you can't find that information, it takes 10 times longer to figure out where it is. And it may be noise to some, but you can tell them to mute that Slack channel or open a folder somewhere because they might need it at some point. They just don't know it yet.
Yeah, you're more in the trance, and I'm more in the house and breakbeat.
I would say the one kind of point to that is, please, as someone who's been on call, do not set up PagerDuty alerts for
don't do that
in the dev environment.
Don't do that.
I think actually one model that we found really useful at Chronosphere, and kind of to Nung's point about having those same signals throughout the pipeline, is for us as a commit is making its way to production. It goes through environments where we do have the same alerts and SLO monitoring that we have in production set up on these environments. But again, to both of your points, that doesn't page a human if something goes wrong, but it tells the release tooling to kind of stop letting that build make it through the pipeline until an issue or until the fix is added. So having those same signals, like you both said, is really important. And kind of gives you an idea of what things will look like when they get to production.
Right. Uma, speaking of signals, at least in my mind, observability is closely joined at the hip with anything related to SREs, and we have better analytics tools. And I guess one of the things that I look at observability, and at least in my humble opinion, we've had continuous monitoring for a long time, but now observability kind of lets us query the system a little bit and investigate a little bit deeper rather than just monitoring a couple of metrics here and there. My question to you, though, is does observability kind of get driven by the fact that you have SREs that know what questions to ask, or someday, or the system is going to get smart enough where I don't need to know what questions to ask because it will tell me, here are the 3 things that are likely to get me fired tomorrow?
Well, that's the hope that everybody, wants to walk towards, that somebody tells me that, this is happening and you don't need humans to go and observe it. So, but that's far from achieving that goal, right? So observability platforms have improved a lot. There's a lot of focus. There's a lot of investment in the last few years to get the observability to the next level, right? So you see Prometheus, open tracing, open telemetry. There's a lot of standards evolving. And then the real fact is, in any big organization, you have multiple monitoring systems, right? So there is a kind of a common layer that's being built out, and then there's data being analyzed for better. So some SREs need to be focusing purely on how to deal with this observability systems, right? So one SRE cannot deal with everything, on incident. How do I automate some of these incidents versus how do I interpret the data being collected, right? So it's one part of the team whose job is to go and make better sense of the observability investments that are already being made. So yeah, AI ops is probably getting there, but what's going on right now with SREs is to try to get better alerts on what this observability systems are telling to avoid certain incidents from happening, or based on the data that's being collected, how do you actually recover faster when such an incident happens next time. So that's probably my take on observability and SREs.
All right. Do you guys agree? John, are we kind of marching down the path of the democratization of SREs by eventually through AI ops? Is that maybe where we're headed? Can everybody be an SRE someday?
I don't, you're still going to have that specialty to understand and digest the problem and where it starts from. I think that those tools will help pinpoint them, but I don't know if they'll be able, who knows, right? We're in 2022, in 20 years, we may all be obsolete as far as IT is concerned. But I think there's still going to need to be that understanding from our side, right? Because there's always going to be a give and take. Your risk reward, your cost to efficiency, and if the systems get there, amazing. I'll be glad to have a few extra hours, days in my week that I can do other things on. But I think it'll just be a supplement. And I think the biggest issue is that analyzation of the data and having it, because there is so much. The data field is rich. It is everywhere. However, it is not standardized. It also requires you to interpret every piece because each system understands the data differently, right? This metric here may not mean the same as this metric over here. So I think we may start to see specializations come out because, for sure, our data teams and SRE teams that we work with are pretty in tandem because SREs understand the systems. They live it, they breathe it, but the data people are going to be your best bet for understanding those metrics and how to build better reports because they're going to ask questions that SREs aren't going to think about. Well, why is this important? Well, why do we need to measure that? And they'll start to get at those main problems. And I think we might see like a slow specialization followed by hopefully an innovation in platforms that can take all that data in and with a click of a button. One day hopefully we'll get there, but I don't think that's going to be now unless someone's got $1 billion ID to dev it right now.
I 100% agree with John. I think for the foreseeable future, there are going to continue to be humans in the loop. I think that with observability tools, and Mike, you kind of mentioned this, the difference between what monitoring observability is. I think it's part of it is the difference between helping you get more and more narrowed down to what the root cause of an issue is and showing you what components were involved as opposed to just knowing something's wrong. But I think for the most interesting sorts of problems, like you're having some flaky connection in one availability zone and the AWS status page is green, but this Slack that you're in of other people in your field, people are talking about seeing weird issues at once. These are all things that require, kind of like John said, a human to get those different signals and really apply that to their intuitive model of what's going on. And I just don't think that, I think at least for the foreseeable future, I don't think that AI ops systems are going to be able to, properly interpret all of that context.
Yeah, when I first heard, the question about AI ops, it immediately was like, okay, how does, AI make the decisions and do the things that a human does? But 3 years ago when I was at reInvent, I ran into a couple of companies and they opened my eyes to using AI for a completely different attack on the problem. And having a machine learning and some kind of algorithm sitting back and watching all of your alerting and your errors and all those pages and aggregating all that data and then looking at it going, okay, well, what are the root, can we find a root cause through analyzing all these incidences and using AI as a tool to help you identify where your gaps are. I found that to be very interesting and very useful.
All right. So, guys, who is an SRE? John, do I just kind of stand up one day and declare that I'm an SRE and say, look, ma, no hands? Or do I need a certificate somewhere that someone bestows upon me, much like a diploma after I've taken some courses and some tests? Or is SRE a state of mind as much as it is a job function?
I think being an SRE will require, this is a tough question, right? Because we get on the subject of certs, right? And I don't think that's a necessity necessarily, right? There's plenty of times where you can get experience being on other teams and being tangential that you might be able to transfer those skills over and it might be an easy fit. However, I would recommend getting certain certs because those tools that you get are very complex. But I think as far as when you understand you're an SRE, I think it's understanding the landscape and technology and the platform that you're using to deploy and be able to have, all your infrastructure on or multiple clouds, right? It doesn't have to just be AWS. It could be GCP, Azure, IBM, Alibaba, whatever, and just understanding how these tools work, how your infrastructure connects to them, and how to deliver that service, right? And I think that understanding is the first part, and then getting how your company does it, what's your sort of modus operandi for those tools, and then understanding how can you improve them, right? What's the next step? How can we reduce incident times, or how can we increase uptime? All those sort of things, and it's just wanting to learn and constantly crave. But I don't know if a certificate will ever be like the stamp of approval, because that's up for debate. Sometimes certificates are just like, I passed the test, and some of them are real world like experience that you have to know the subject before you get them. But I think that's up for debate.
All right. Now, what's your take? I mean, you get the certification, somebody gives you the little badge, it looks very nice, but then we have, that old movie, I think it was Humphrey Bogart, where the guys were saying, we don't need no stinking badges. So
badges, we don't need no stinking badges. Yes. Man, it's all in when you have to show up and prove that you can handle it, right? It's not the certifications that, there's certifications is a test, and the real test is when you show up for the job and you can do it. Some people like to think that they can fake it till they make it, and that may get you in the door, but it may not keep you there. And the metrics of downtime, mean time to resolution, the amount of failures in between things, and how, it all comes into whether or not you can handle it. And unfortunately, it's one of those things that may take the first 90 days on a new job to identify whether you can hack it or not. Getting better at interviewing is going to be your key as far as someone who's out there trying to filter out the wheat from the chaff.
All right. So, Matt, is that viable? Because, in Nung's model, you should hire 3 and hope that 2 work out and see what happens.
I do think interviewing for SREs is tough, and I've seen it at multiple organizations. The challenges. I think like one interview pattern that I've seen work well at a few places for people in an SRE role is kind of an interactive debugging interview, we called it, where you kind of describe you describe a system, describe like a contrived failure in it. And then the interviewer is kind of like the interactive terminal of, this person's trying to go through and debug it. I think the way that you get experience to kind of successfully interview for SRE roles is kind of being thrown into it. I've seen a lot of people that, previously had no SRE experience that were interested in it, join an SRE team, but they were really curious and wanted to learn, all these components of the stack and everything, and they really thrived. And it is tough though, because I think a lot of what you need to ramp up those skills is just seeing it in production. So it's definitely a chicken and egg problem of, you get the experience by seeing it, but you have to get your foot in the door and see it in the first place. So I don't know what the perfect answer is there.
Uma, what's your best advice? And I guess I would add this to the topic. We are seeing this shift to microservices. Things are getting more complex. There's containers everywhere. The environment changes more frequently. Will that just not force the issue? At some point, you're going to need an SRE if you make that transition. And as that occurs, how do I figure out who has the chops to make that, short of, what might be called on-the-job training? But that gets expensive and it gets risky.
Yeah, so when you form an SRE team, you need different people with different skill sets, right? So you need somebody to observe, somebody to do the most obvious tasks. But those are not who you're trying to hire. Maybe you already have some other people in different teams in your existing other teams that you can move on. When you're trying to hire SRE, you need an expert that can do something that cannot be done with an existing team member, right? So that's what you're trying to hire. So hiring a good SRE is like hiring a good developer, right? You need to have a very good debugging skills, think out of the box, and bring the solution by automating it, right? You cannot point fingers at somebody, like somebody else will do the work for me. You have to fix it, right? So owning that up, thinking out of the box, and then being creative and developing is like hiring a great developer, right? So this is, and the certs definitely will not give you that. What certs give you is a badge that maybe certain best practices. Instead of reading a book, you're getting a badge, right? That's all about it. And on the microservices part, Mike, you mentioned that yes, moving on to microservices bring in more complexity, more dynamism. Initially, you feel like things are going to be easy with a lot of containers, but eventually there's so many of them, and then the reliability is a question on how you are achieving it. So SRE is a needed function, and then the SRE team has to have certain star developers. That's who you need to hire, right? So they see the challenge that's not written very well, and they figure out the problem statement, and then they go and solve it out, right, by automating, most likely.
John, should I have HR involved in looking for these folks? Because I'm asking the question because they'll put out a request looking for people with 10 plus years of SRE experience. And of course, we'll only find, maybe 3 people in the world that even knew what an SRE was back then. So, most people have only like 2 or 3 years of experience. So should everybody just go look for their own SREs, because you're not going to get much help outside of the rest of the organization?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think, in technology in general, we have to be more cognizant of like those asks, right? And make sure to put that caveat of like, you may not qualify for, 70% of this, but if they're transferable skills, like apply, right? Like that's a thing that, I have done in my whole career, because like, most of it I fit. And then there's a few I'm like, I don't know that, but I can figure that out. Right. Like, and that's my personality, but a lot of people don't feel that way. Right. Especially it's shown in studies that women are less likely to apply if they don't fit 100%. And like, we need to make them and other people who don't feel comfortable applying to those roles, because that diversity will continue to expand our thinking. They bring, depending on your experience set, right? Like I started out as a mom and pop brake shop fix guy when I got started in IT like 15 years ago. And the reason I have the skills I do today is because I get thrown into like some on-site, like a mechanic shop, and they're like, we're running Windows 95, it's 2010, and you got to fix this machine, but nobody knows how to fix it. So like these type of skills are transferable, but someone may not realize that. They may be like, oh, I do need a certification, or I do have to check every single box. And I think we just need to be better at communicating that fact of like, you may not fit all this, but if you get close, go ahead and apply.
Yeah,
right, go ahead.
I really agree with John. I think it's kind of like our responsibility as, an industry and as a role to like take that chance on people and help level them up. Because at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do, and it benefits everyone more so than excluding people.
All right. Yeah. I think John hit on something there. I think the truth of the matter is most guys don't actually read the job description anymore. They read the directions and they just apply. But then that's how we go. Gentlemen, thank you for being on this latest adventure here. Folks, also up in your top right there's a little handouts button. You can find a couple of things up there you might want to take with you just to check out as we go along. And with that, we're at the top of the hour, and Cody's got some things he's got to say to folks on the way out. But guys, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mike, and to the rest of our panel. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. So I would like to remind our audience that this session was recorded. So following this panel, you'll receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand, or you can find it living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and be sure to look in the on-demand section. So our 4 winners of our 4 $25 Amazon gift card drawing, we have Chika O, Manjul M, Rudy W, and Paul B. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. please keep an eye on your inbox to claim your gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, just check your spam folder. So we do appreciate everyone spending time with us today. We ask for one extra moment of your time to fill out a brief post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at an upcoming TechStrong Learning workshop or webinar. Everyone, have a great rest of your day. And to our panel, once more, thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye, guys.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Have a good one.